Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of the House Detective Diaries, where I take you through my top 5 most interesting finds from the previous couple of weeks' research. This fortnight I'm going to be telling you about a couple of hookers. No, not that kind of hooker, different kind of hooker. Then I'm going to be showing you some great photos of a wonderful corner store in Fortitude Valley, then, and now. Then I'm going to tell you a little bit about how an ad for a circus helped me work out when that store was actually built. We're then going to travel all the way down to Sydney, and I'm going to tell you about a Kirribilli house, but it's not that Kirribilli house, it's a different Kirribilli house, but equally interesting in my opinion. And finally, I'm going to tell you about another house in Sydney, this time at Balmain, and it's called the Waterman's Cottage. I hope you enjoy watching. Coming in at number 5, a couple of hookers. So I was researching a house at Ashgrove, and I've actually discussed this a little bit in a previous episode, but the land was subdivided by Henry Holmes into the Holmesbrook estate, and there's actually still a Holmesbrook Street in this area of Ashgrove that's named for him. Now this was subdivided in 1878. By 1888, the whole estate was owned by a gentleman called William James Hooker. Now I thought to myself, W.J. Hooker, he has to have been related to L.J. Hooker, both in real estate, both in property development. But when I looked into it, I discovered that Leslie Joseph Hooker, L.J. Hooker, was actually born Leslie Joseph Tingyu. So he actually had Chinese heritage, and this was kept very secret for many, many years. It's thought possibly to help with his business dealings and avoid discrimination. But even his family didn't know about this Chinese heritage for many, many years. And he had changed his name from Tingyu to Hooker in 1925 by deed poll. So I could easily tell then that the W.J. Hooker I was researching was not related to the L.J. Hooker, but I'd uncovered a very interesting fact anyway. Number 4. I was researching a property in Fortitude Valley, and in the process of trying to find old photos of it, I discovered this remarkable photo of a fabulous 2-story timber corner store on the corner of James and Arthur Streets in the valley. And in the photograph it was set up as a news agency, and I later found out that it was probably built in about 1899 by Michael Lyons. And I thought, well, being that old, there's no way it could possibly have escaped development on James Street. But I had a look on Google Maps and it was still there. I couldn't believe it. Absolutely remarkable. So I then did a little bit more searching, and I managed to find a photo of it from 1989 as well. And I shared these photos on my Facebook page and Instagram, and it went crazy with people who remembered previous tenancies that had been there and that type of thing. And in general, we're all very excited that such an old building had survived in such a high density and high development area. So a good news story. Number 3. This one's actually connected to the previous building that I was talking about, the corner store on the corner of James and Arthur Streets. When I started to look into the history of that building a little bit more, I discovered that it was actually connected to the property that I was researching. So it became crucial to find out when that store building had actually been built. Now, I had a certificate of title for the property that dated from 1896, and the owner, 1897, and the owner at that time was Michael Lyons. But what I wanted to know was, did he build it, or was there already the building on the land when he bought it, and it was the previous owner that had constructed it? So I did a little bit of searching in Trove for old advertisements and articles. I looked in post office directories. I searched all the usual sources. And I found a rather unusual piece of information that gave me a little bit of an insight and helped narrow the date down. And this was an ad for a circus. The circus was located on the corner of James and Arthur Streets. So through a process of elimination, I looked at the 4 different corners on that intersection to work out whether it could have been on any of the other corners. One corner had the Queen's Arms Hotel, which I showed some great photos of in the previous episode. two of the corners definitely had properties on them by that day, and that left the third corner where that two-story shop was subsequently built. Now it's described as a mammoth circus, so it obviously was quite a large circus, and the fact that it was operating from that block of land on the corner of those streets told me that there's no way that that building could have been built in 1892 when the circus was there. So that helped narrow the date down further. I then subsequently did another search, and I ended up finding an ad for that parcel of land from 1896, and there was no mention of any buildings on the property, or they're often called improvements in these ads, buildings, fencing, that type of thing. There was no mention of that, so that confirmed that there'd been no building on there built by the previous owner, and it had indeed been built by Michael Lyons after he bought the land in 1896, and in fact it was built in about 1899. So there you go, a circus helped me narrow down the date of construction of a building. Didn't see that one coming. Number 2. As I mentioned, we're going to go all the way down to Sydney for this one, and we're going to look at a house at Kirribilli. And no, it's not Kirribilli House where the Prime Minister lives, although it is just up the road from there. It's right on Sydney Harbour, right next to the Harbour Bridge, and it is the most amazing location. It's now called Studley Royal, this building, and the owners were curious. It's an apartment building now. The owners were curious where this name came from and also when their building had been built. I started doing a little bit of research into it, and I found that the current apartment building was actually a wing to a much larger complex, and this wing had been added in 1905. The property at that time was called Ellesmere, and it was a really upmarket boarding establishment and holiday venue for people. In the heart of this boarding establishment complex was a huge grand Victorian era mansion, and it had been built by Paul Talbot in about 1880. And Paul Talbot was a very successful wool merchant, and he would have actually been able to see his wool stores over in Circular Quay from his property. So this house had eventually evolved into flats. Those flats had then been extended, and then this extra wing was added as well. And the name of the original house was Ellesmere, and that remained the name of the complex for many, many decades. Eventually the name was changed to Studley Royal, and a number of the buildings on the block were demolished, but amazingly the original 1880s mansion is still there. It's been very, very altered, and I believe it's still units, and then the 1905 wing is still there as well. So quite a remarkable property, and as I said, it's got probably some of the best views in Australia, and it was wonderful to uncover its original story. We're going to stay in Sydney now, but we're going to pop from Kirribilli over to Balmain. I was down in Sydney last weekend for a whirlwind trip, and I was down there with my mum. So she wanted to go over to Balmain, where she and my dad used to live, and they used to run an art gallery out of a terrace house on Darling Street, which is the main street through Balmain. It's a massive hub of activity and cafes and shops now. And so we went back and had a look, and we found where the terrace was that they'd lived in. Now, they had the opportunity to buy this building in the early 1970s for $30,000. It's now probably worth about $10 million. So it's the nest egg I never had, but never mind. It was great to go back and see it. And while we were there, we walked down through some of the streets Mum and Dad used to stroll along as well, and we went down to the harbour and had a look. And we came across this amazing stone house on the corner, right down near the harbour. And it really piqued my interest because firstly I could tell it was a very, very old building. So we went and had a bit of a closer look at it. And it turns out it's known as the Waterman's Cottage. And it was built in 1841. Now, this is a time where Brisbane didn't even exist as a city yet. Brisbane was still a penal colony. It had closed in 1839, but the main convict colony and convict buildings was still there. However, it was not yet open to free settlers. So this, in context of Brisbane history, is a very old building. The cottage was home to a gentleman called Henry Mackenzie for many years, from I think it was about 1880 till 1912. And the story goes that he used to row people back and forth from Balmain to Sydney CBD when the ferries weren't running, and that's a fair distance to row, so old Henry must have been pretty fit. But I just thought that was a lovely little story, and I could just imagine someone knocking on his door in this little house and saying, "Can you please take me to work?" The other amazing thing about this cottage is that it still has timber shingles on the roof. Now, of course, they're not the original shingles, but it is so unusual to see these on houses these days. And the only reason I know that is because there was an open house next door, and Mum and I went in and had a bit of a sticky beak, and you could see out the windows of the neighbouring house you could look down on the roof next door of this cottage and see the shingled roof. So that was absolutely incredible to see, and very unusual to still find, as I said. So very cool little house in Balmain. So that was this fortnight's top 5 finds. I hope you enjoyed watching. I'm going to be taking a quick break over the Christmas and New Year period, but I'll be back in 2024 with more interesting finds to share with you.